Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we sift through the flotsam and jetsam of the last week on the Vatican beat, looking for those few nuggets of gold, those few precious gems that you really want to have. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with a pope upstaged. Normally, when a pontiff presides over a major event in St. Peter's Square, he is the unchallenged, unrivaled, undisputed star of the show, but that was not the case this past Sunday, as legendary Italian actor and comedian Roberto Benigni actually dominated the platform during the Vatican's first ever World Children's Day. We'll explain what went down and how Benigni stole the show. Second, we've got churning over China. The Vatican sponsors a major conference on China here in Rome this past week, where both sides in the relationship between Rome and Beijing sort of put their cards on the table in terms of what they really want and expect, and the outlines of a sort of tentative deal seem to come into focus. We'll explain what was said and why it matters. Third up this week, cops and robbers. In this case, cops spelled C-O-P-T-S, referring to the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, where recently a senior Vatican official was forced to go to try to calm the waters after a dispute over the Vatican's hyper-controversial document over the blessing of same-sex unions. We'll explain why we know what was said, but we are very confused about what it meant, and we'll try to unpack all of that for you. Fourth up this week, we've got a millennial saint. Pope Francis signs off on a miracle attributed to Carlo Acutis, an Italian beato who died at the age of 15 in 2006, and who is now set to become the Church's very first millennial saint. We'll explain why there is a great deal of enthusiasm over this particular sainthood candidate. And finally, a Jubilee heads up, how a taxi strike in Rome this past week set off an alarm bell that you ought to be paying attention to if you are seriously considering being one of the expected 35 million people who are going to visit Rome next year for the Great Jubilee. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church. So please, do not go anywhere. Do not touch that dial. We will be right back. This is our official Last Week in the Church infomercial, because I come to you with a special offer for all of those would-be Catholic eggheads out there. That is, if you're the kind of person who likes sounding smart, who likes creating the impression that you know things other people don't. That certainly describes me. If that describes you, you're going to want to know about this. Now, I've already spoken about this new app, this new online resource called Magisterium AI. Basically, what it allows you to do is to type in a question like, what does it mean that the Pope is infallible? Or what does the Catholic Church teach about the environment? Or, whatever. And it will give you a short, smart, easily digestible answer based on more than 5,000 official magisterial texts. But recently, these guys have created a new feature on the app. It's called the scholarly mode, which draws not just on official texts, but also the best and brightest of Catholic thinkers and theologians over the centuries, from Augustine and Aquinas to more contemporary figures. And we'll also give you a very quick answer about what those folks have had to say about what the Church teaches on various issues. Now, I promise you that if you try this once, you're going to wonder how in God's name you ever lived without it. It's brought to you by our friends at Longbeard. They are the digital marketing and design company that provide the IT backbone for Crux. They provide the same service for a slew of other Catholic organizations and outfits. They're brilliant, and they are creative, and they are tremendous. And I'm kind of out of adjectives at this point, which is saying something because I traffic in adjectives. But I am telling you, these people are the absolute level best. So check it out. This is Magisterium AI, their new scholarly mode. You're going to dig it. Magisterium.com. That is magisterium.com. It comes with my personal guarantee. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, May 28th, in the year of our Lord 2024. Beautiful springtime here in Rome. I hope things are glorious in regenerating life wherever you find yourselves these days. We begin this week with a pope upstaged. So, Pope Francis recently decided to convene an event called the World Children's Day. This is sort of by way of analogy to the World Youth Day created by the late Saint Pope John Paul II, which is an event largely for adolescents and young adults. Pope Francis decided that the church needed a companion event for young children. And so he entrusted, well, basically, officials who used to run the show for the Franciscan presence in Assisi, entrusted them with coming up with a program for a World Children's Day, the first edition of which was celebrated this weekend in Rome. It involved an event Saturday night in Rome's Olympic Stadium for a crowd of young people from around the world, children estimated at around 50,000. And then it culminated with a mass in St. Peter's Square Sunday morning for the same group. Now, here's the thing. Normally, when a pope is presiding over an event in St. Peter's Square, he is obviously the dominant personality, right? I mean, he is the key point of reference. Everybody waits for when the Pope opens his mouth. Everything the Pope says or does, that is the focus of everyone's attention. Everyone else is kind of a bit player. However, in this instance, the organizers of this event had the masterstroke of deciding to invite Roberto Benigni to be a presenter. Basically, they asked him to give a reflection at this Sunday morning mass. They told him he could have 20 minutes and he could say basically whatever he wanted. Now, to Americans, Benigni is best known for his 1997 Oscar-winning film, Life is Beautiful. But to Italians, he is a cultural institution, right? I mean, he's sort of like a cross between Jerry Seinfeld and Johnny Carson, just like the most beloved comedic figure in Italian national life. And so his presence guaranteed this was going to be a big deal. And Benigni, who was like this irrepressible personality, right? The magic of it is you never know what he's going to say. Basically just completely cut loose. So he started Sunday morning by bounding onto the stage in St. Peter's Square and saying that when he had arrived that morning, the Swiss guards told him he could do whatever he wanted. The one thing he couldn't do was touch the Pope. He said that then became immediately the one thing he actually wanted to do. He said he wanted to go plant a kiss on Pope Francis and said, what the hell? I'm going to do it. He said, because what's the point of kisses if you don't actually give them? He said, I'm going to give this kiss in the name of everybody here. It's worth 100,000. And he just basically bounded up to the papal throne, planted a couple of kisses on Pope Francis, on the cheeks of a beaming and obviously delighted Pope Francis. Then Benigni came back down and told this story about how when he was a little kid, somebody asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said very seriously that he wanted to be the Pope. Now, he said the thing of it is, everybody who heard him busted a gut laughing, so he decided, because he got a laugh, he was going to become a comic. But he said, suppose they had fallen to their knees instead of laughing, I probably could have become Pope. And then he said, you know what? Maybe the next time there's an election, I'm going to run. I'll be a candidate for the papacy. And he looked at Francis and he said, Holiness, when's the next election? Then he said, but you know what? I don't want to run after you. I want to run with you. Why don't we run together? We'll form a big ticket and we'll put on the ballot Jorge Mario Bergoglio called Francis. We'll win in a landslide. And of course, everybody was like dying of laughter as he went through all of this. Benigni then turned to the crowd of kids and said, you know what? In this crowd, there may be a future Michelangelo, there may be a future Galileo, but there also may be a future Pope. There may be an African Pope. There may be an Asian Pope. There may be a Pope from a working class neighborhood here in Rome, the Pope of Testaccio. And then he said, maybe even the first woman Pope. And the thing of it is, like, only Roberto Benigni could get away with this in public because, like, even the cardinals who were on hand were, like, doubled over laughing out loud as he went through this whole litany. Benigni then turned somewhat serious, saying to the children, look, the first thing we adults need to do is learn from you when it comes to war. Because it's when little kids are playing war, when they're playing soldier, the moment one of them actually gets hurt, they stop. And Benini said, real wars should be like that. The first time a child gets hurt, the war should stop. That should be the rule. And, why can't we do that? And then he sort of charged the children who were present with being the ones who would finally put an end to war. And his sort of concluding remark to the group was, don't wait for the world to take care of you. It is you who need to take care of the world. And he expressed complete confidence that they would be able to do that. It was a kind of masterful, classic Roberto Benigni performance. And it's also a reminder of the enormous, unique power to convene that a pope has. I mean, only a pope could decide, you know what, Sunday morning, I want Roberto Benigni to play my event. And he would actually do it. Okay? I mean, who else on the planet has that kind of ability to bring people together? And what we saw this weekend was that capacity in action. It was a remarkable performance. The idea is that this World Children's Day will become a staple of Catholic life. We will, of course, see how it proceeds as we go forward. All right, second up this week, we have churning over China. So, the Vatican's Pontifical Urban University was the setting this week of a conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 1924 Council of Shanghai. This was an ecclesiastical council that took place in China, obviously before the Communist Revolution, that in a sense set the tone for the modern life of the Catholic Church in China. It was a sort of post-colonial attempt to set the Catholic Church on a new footing, on a pathway towards a more indigenous and authentically Chinese way of being Catholic. And so this event at the Urban University, which is the university here in Rome where seminarians from the so-called developing world, that is from Africa, from Asia, some parts of Oceania, and so on, it's where they typically are in residence when they're studying at one of Rome's major universities. And so, therefore, seminarians from China would stay at the Urban University. It became the setting for this 100-year anniversary look back at this all-important Council of Shanghai. And what made this gathering significant is that in addition to the Vatican heavy hitters who showed up, so you had Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, meaning the Pope's top diplomat. You had Cardinal Luis Antonio Chito Tagli of the Philippines, who is one of the heads of the Vatican's dicastery for evangelization. But in addition to that, you also had incredibly significant figures from the Catholic Church in China, and not just the kind of unofficial version of the Catholic Church that is loyal to the Pope, but also the official leadership of the Catholic Church that is recognized and accepted by the Chinese government. So you had Bishop Joseph Shenbin of Shanghai, who was named to that position actually by the Chinese government without the Pope's approval. Now, the Pope later signed on, but nevertheless, his appointment at the time was seen as the Chinese government once again sort of asserting its dominance over Catholic life at the expense of the Pope's rule. You also had the official leader of the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which is the government body which either, well, if you want to use the polite term, you would say oversees or guides Catholic life in China. If you want to use the term that many critics would use, controls Catholic life in China on behalf of the country's communist government. But in any event, sort of the official regulatory body, if you like, was also present. And if you look at the remarks that everyone who took part in this event made, it seems that the kind of lines of Rome-Beijing relations today were quite clear. On the Chinese side, that is from Bishop Shenbin, also from the head of the Patriotic Association, what you had was a strong condemnation of the history of colonialism and foreign missionaries in China, strong condemnation of the idea that China ought to be subject to foreign control, and therefore clear assertion that the future of Catholicism in China has to be as part of the, as Shenbin put it, as part of the great Chinese national project, and not as a kind of foreign presence that owed its allegiance to someone outside the Chinese context. In other words, was a clear clarion call for what is sometimes called the Sinicization of the Catholic Church in China, meaning the Chinesization. That is, that the Catholic Church in China has to be fully Chinese and not beholden to any exterior party, up to and including the Pope, if by the Pope we mean a political figure rather than a religious or spiritual leader. That was the Chinese side. Now, on the Vatican side, if we look at what Parolin had to say, what Tagle had to say, their message seemed to be they were willing to buy the Sinicization argument. That is, the argument that Catholicism in China needs to be authentically indigenous. But they seem to be saying there also needs to be a clear, stable, permanent relationship with the Vatican as part of that equation. Let's remember that not so long ago, Cardinal Parolin had floated the idea of opening an office for a permanent representative of the Vatican in China without explicitly resurrecting that idea. That seemed to be what he was referring to in his presentation. In other words, it seemed to be that the outlines of the deal here were that the Vatican is willing to accept this argument that the Catholic Church in China has to be ever more authentically Chinese, not beholden to any kind of foreign presence, but at the price of insisting that there has to be a stable, permanent, official, above ground relationship between Beijing and the Vatican as a kind of down payment eventually on full diplomatic relations. Now, that seems to be the pitch the Vatican is making. Supporters will see that as part of a long-term process of normalization in relations between Rome and Beijing, which will be for the good of the Catholic community there. Critics, such as Cardinal Joseph Zen, the retired Bishop of Hong Kong, undoubtedly will see this as part of a process of placating Beijing, that is, sort of making a deal with the devil and giving away far too much for very little in terms of concrete concessions on the part of the Chinese government. That debate is going to go on, but in any event, what this past week teaches us is that the Vatican under Pope Francis is not reconsidering its position. On the contrary, they are moving full steam ahead. All right, third up this week, we have cops and robbers. In this case, cops spelled C-O-P-T-S, referring to the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, one of the largest Christian communities in the Middle East, and an Orthodox community with which the Catholic Church has made great ecumenical strides in recent years. There has been a gradual fall, if you like, in recent decades in the relationship between the Copts and the Catholics. Part of this, there is a natural sort of synchronicity here if you consider that the Coptic Orthodox Church is the only other Christian church in the world that is led by a pope. You know, we've got our pope, his name is Francis. The Copts have their pope, his name is Tewodros II. And the two men, by all accounts, have enjoyed a very warm and friendly relationship. In fact, not long ago, Pope Francis made the unusual decision of including a number of Coptic martyrs in the official Roman martyrology. In other words, taking the very rare step of including non-Catholic martyrs in the Catholic Church's own official sort of compendium of martyrs. And this was considered a great ecumenical gesture. However, things have come to kind of a standstill of late because after the Vatican in late December issued Fiducia Supplicans, this highly controversial document on the blessing of same-sex unions, the Coptic Church in Egypt was one of those Orthodox bodies that took a close look at the document and basically said, we can't buy this. That is, we do not agree with the position articulated in this document. And so on March 7th, they announced that they were suspending their theological dialogue with the Vatican pending further examination and further discussion. Now, all of this set the stage for a trip in recent days to Egypt by Argentine Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez. He is the head of the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith and, in effect, the primary author of Fiducia Supplicans. Now, Fernandez obviously went to Egypt to try to, pour oil on the waters, try to smooth out, the trouble in the relationship. And to the surprise of many observers, he said that the Vatican actually agreed completely with the theological analysis that the Coptic Church had issued in March of Fiducia Supplicans. That is, he said, I can affirm everything in this document. Now, this was to be quite honest, a great surprise to many people, because if you look attentively at that document that the Copts issued, among other things, there is a codicil in that document in which the Coptic Church says that a homosexual who is not resisting his or her condition, that is, who has accepted his or her condition, and who refuses psychological or spiritual treatment to try to correct his or her condition, that person is worse than an adulterer or a fornicator and should be separated from communion. Now, let us be clear. The Catholic Church has never said that an LGBTQ plus person who rejects psychological or spiritual corrective therapy should be denied communion. If it is in fact true that the Vatican is now endorsing that position, it would obviously be huge news. Is that actually what Fernandez meant? Well, the problem is nobody really knows, okay? It's not entirely clear if this was just something Fernandez said in an attempt to get the relationship back on the right track, with the idea being we'll figure out the fine points later, or if he actually meant that the Vatican was prepared to endorse all the fine points of this analysis by the Coptic Church. That's something that's going to have to be clarified going forward, but I think what it illustrates, sort of 2 points. One is that the fallout from Fiducia Supplicans is not over. The reverberations it set off are continuing to be felt, and the questions that it raised, in many cases, still do not have clear answers. And the second point, this is not entirely an intra-Catholic exercise. Yes, there were lots of Catholic bishops and Catholic leaders who were upset by Fiducia, including the bishops of the entire African continent. But this episode illustrates to us that in the 21st century, what happens inside any one Christian church is never going to be circumscribed entirely by the boundaries of that church. It will also have ecumenical consequences, and we are watching all that play out in real time. All right, fourth up this week, we have a millennial saint. So this week, Pope Francis authorized the recognition of a second miracle attributed to Italian Carlo Acutis. Acutis was born in, well, he's history's first millennial saint. You know, the millennial generation is that generation that was born between 1981 rather, and 1996. He was born in 1991, died in 2006 at the age of 15. He is known for many things, and we should say this news that Acutis is going to be canonized. It has generated tremendous enthusiasm because Acutis is known for many things. First of all, as I say, the first saint of the millennial generation, which is like, it's a big deal, right? I mean, you know, we call the millennial generation or Generation Y. I mean, hell, my wife Elise is a millennial, all right? She was born between 1981 and 1996. I mean, if Acutis were alive today, he would be 33, which is more, you know, close to my wife's age. So people in this generation obviously can identify Acutis as one of their own. Clearly not my generation, by the way. I am a fogey. I'm a dinosaur by any chronological or generational standard. But even I find it exciting that we have a role model of sanctity in this generation that is often seen as tremendously secular and unchurched. And nevertheless, here is Carlo Acutis as a kind of towering counterexample. Second, Acutis is kind of a saint of the ordinary. You know, his remains are currently preserved after his beatification. They are preserved in a tomb that you can go visit in Assisi here in Italy. And you know how, like, saints normally, like if it's a bishop, he's wearing his mitre and his vestments, or if it was a hermit, they're wearing their sackcloth and ash or whatever. I mean, usually they have a kind of, you know what I mean, like a distinctive saintly look. You look at Acutis laying in his tomb, he is wearing a jogging jacket, jeans, and Nike tennis shoes. Okay, he just looks like an ordinary, recognizable teenager. And in that sense, you know, he's what the Italians call un santo del quotidiano, an everyday saint, right? One who is clearly recognizable from our experience. Third, he is known as a saint of the internet because he was highly active on social media and designing web pages and so on. He was kind of an influencer, to use that term. Now, in a way, this is technically not true. The Catholic Church already has a patron saint of the internet designated by the late Pope John Paul II. It's Saint Isidore of Seville. But here's the thing. Isidore of Seville lived in the year 600, okay? A little bit before the internet came along. Now, he got this designation because he was responsible for producing an encyclopedia that was kind of the Wikipedia of his day. But let's face it, in terms of a saint who was actually an internet user, right? Acutis is kind of the new kid in town, and therefore very exciting to lots of people. And then finally, his devotion, his strongest devotion, was to the Eucharist, and particularly to Eucharistic miracles. He came up with a kind of virtual exhibition on Eucharistic miracles that has become very popular in Catholic life, and at a time when devotion to the Eucharist is seemed to be in some ways under threat or on the wane. Acutis's strong faith, strong Eucharistic faith, is therefore inspirational. The Vatican has not yet set a date for the canonization. However, the liturgical feast of his beatification is in October. There is some expectation that Pope Francis may decide to stage the canonization this October in the middle of his Synod of Bishops on synodality. If not, it might occur during the Jubilee year of 2025. One other interesting footnote about the Acutis cause is that the miracle that cleared the way for his canonization is the miraculous healing of a teenage Costa Rican girl who lives here in Italy, who in 2022 fell off her bike and experienced a cranial trauma, which was considered to be life-threatening. And she was healed of this when her mom went on a pilgrimage to Assisi and prayed at Acutis's tomb. Point is, here's one teenage saint healing another teenage saint. And in a time when, how do we evangelize the young, right? How do we pass on the faith to the next generation is a kind of defining Catholic question. What we're going to see whenever this canonization occurs is that the remains of this teenage saint are going to be on display, and this teenage Miracolata, that is this girl who was healed by this saint's intercession, is going to be there telling his story. Should be an interesting evangelical moment. All right, final this week, very briefly, a Jubilee heads up. So this past Tuesday, there was a nationwide taxi strike in Italy in which all taxi drivers basically refused to take calls for the day. Some wags raised the question, how is that different than any other day when it is notoriously hard to find cabs in this country? But the truth of it is, it basically brought public transportation in Italy screeching to a halt. Now, here's the thing. If you run the numbers, Italy, and Rome in particular, is tremendously underserved by taxis in comparison to other major European cities. Proportionate to its population, Rome only has about 1/3 the taxi fleet of, say, London or Paris. This is because there are extremely strong taxi unions here in Italy that don't want to see new licenses issued because to them that means more competition, which would drive down the earnings of the drivers who are already out in the field. So they restrict not only the issuance of new taxi licenses, they also restrict permission for private drivers, for instance, Uber drivers, to be out in the field. In Rome, there are only about 7,400 taxi licenses, and there are just more than 1,000 licenses for Uber drivers, which is a ridiculously low number. Now, in advance of the Jubilee year, when 35 million extra visitors are expected in this town, city government here in Rome has announced that they're going to release 1,000 additional taxi licenses. Now, that will not come anywhere close to meeting the need. It would help. However, they just had a press conference this past week in which they announced, well, we think this competition is going to get underway sometime this summer. We think it'll be finished sometime in the fall, and we hope to have these licenses out before the Jubilee begins. If you know anything about the pace of Italian bureaucracy, you are likely to take those promises with a massive industrial-sized grain of salt. Here's my heads up. If you are planning to come to Rome for the Jubilee, think about how you plan to get around the city. You can, of course, use public transportation. Now, it is going to be overcrowded, late, deeply unpleasant, and at times unavailable, but nevertheless, it is a possibility. On the other hand, if you are thinking about trying to use cabs, even if it's just a matter of getting from the airport to your hotel or the train station to your hotel or whatever, my advice to you is don't count on it. You might want to be thinking about options for hiring a car and driver right now. There will be people available. It can be a little on the expensive side. Usually it's about 40 to 50 euro an hour, depending on what your needs are. But I'm telling you, you will save yourself a mountain of heartache if you make some of these plans in advance. Do not count on the ability to get off your plane at Rome's Fiumicino Airport and pick up a cab in anything approaching real chronological time, because the situation, ladies and gentlemen, is likely to be more eschatological. Now, you might think that's spiritually edifying, but I'm telling you, after a long international flight, when the only thing you want to do is take a nap and instead you're waiting 7 hours in line at Fiumicino, I'm not sure how spiritually edified you're going to feel. So my advice to you is, heads up, word to the wise, be ready, because an unpleasant experience may be on its way. All right, that is our show for this week. As ever, you can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week. We will talk to you again very soon.